Claire Morgan never expected life after 48 to feel this hollow. Her days passed quietly, wrapped in soft routines and unspoken sadness. She lived alone now, in a modest second-floor apartment that overlooked a sleepy tree-lined street. The walls held the echoes of laughter that once filled her home, back when her children were young and her marriage still breathed life. Now, the rooms whispered with silence. Her mornings began with the same ritual, a steaming cup of coffee, cradled between her palms, as she sat near the window watching the world continue without her. There was a time she imagined her later years would be full of contentment, maybe even peace. But no one tells you how lonely peace can feel when it arrives without joy. She wasn't broken, not in a dramatic movie scene way. There were no tears on the floor or shattered picture frames. Claire was composed, kind, and quietly functioning. She volunteered at the library on Wednesdays, baked far too much banana bread, and sent texts to her children that always ended with a heart emoji. But inside, something was missing. It wasn't just the absence of her ex-husband, or the echo left behind by grown children. It was a longing she couldn't name. Not for chaos or passion necessarily, but for feeling. Something deep. Something that stirred the heart, instead of just helping time pass. That's when a small moment, almost unnoticeable, shifted everything. It was a Thursday afternoon, cloudy but warm, when Claire stepped into a little bookstore she hadn't visited in years. Pine and Page had always been her sanctuary before life grew too busy. She hadn't planned to go in. It was just on the way home, and something about the old green sign above the door called to her. Maybe she was chasing a memory. Maybe she just didn't want to go home to an empty apartment again. The familiar bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the smell of old pages and wood polish greeted her like an old friend. She walked slowly between the shelves, trailing her fingers along spines of novels she used to love. That's when she heard a soft male voice reading aloud. Not loud, but just enough for the words to float between the aisles. She turned a corner and saw him. He was standing by the poetry shelf. Mid-50s, perhaps. Salt and pepper hair, a little unshaven, wearing a worn leather jacket. He was reading a Pablo Neruda poem aloud, quietly to himself, as if he didn't notice or didn't care that anyone else was around. There was something about the way he read, like he wasn't just saying the words, he felt them. Each line held weight, and yet there was gentleness in his voice, as if he were reading to someone he missed. Claire didn't mean to stare, but she did. And when he looked up and caught her eyes, something inside her shifted. He smiled, easy and warm, and said, "Didn't mean to steal your corner. I get a little carried away in here." Claire, caught off guard but charmed, replied, "I know the feeling." And just like that, something unspoken passed between them, like two people recognizing something familiar in a stranger. It was a small moment, a blink, really. But Claire would remember it long after she left the shop. Because after so many years of quiet, she had felt something stir, a soft flutter, a spark. And deep down, though she didn't know it yet, a new chapter had just begun. The second time Claire saw him, it no longer felt like chance. It felt like something the universe had gently planned. She returned to Pine and Page a week later, telling herself it was just to browse, maybe pick up a new novel, but deep down she knew. She hoped he'd be there. And he was. This time he wasn't reading poetry. He was behind the counter, placing new arrivals onto the shelf, his sleeves rolled up, eyes focused, mouth moving slightly as if he were still having a conversation with the books. When he noticed her, his face lit up with the kind of warmth that made something in Claire's chest bloom. "Back for another poem?" he asked with a playful edge, and she laughed, surprised by how natural it felt to be noticed, to be remembered. His name was Daniel Hart. They ended up talking for over an hour that afternoon, first about books, then about everything else that seemed to matter more. She learned he was 52, a former literature professor who had returned to his hometown to care for his aging mother after losing his wife 3 years earlier. There was a calmness about him, a thoughtful stillness that felt safe, yet beneath it all, something deep and bruised lived in his eyes, a quiet pain Claire recognized all too well. As they shared stories, she noticed how he listened not just to respond, but to understand. He wasn't trying to impress her or fix her. He was just present. And that, in itself, was rare. Claire found herself opening up in a way she hadn't done in years. She told him about her children, her failed marriage, the loneliness that crept into her evenings like fog. "I thought I was past the part where people start over," she admitted softly, a half laugh escaping her lips as if to make light of her own sadness. But Daniel didn't laugh. He just looked at her, gently and without pity, and said, "Maybe we don't start over. Maybe we just turn the page." That sentence echoed in her for hours after they said goodbye. It wasn't dramatic or romantic in the way novels described love. It was better. It was real, honest, quiet, like a sunrise rather than a lightning storm. Something about Daniel made her feel seen, not as a mother, or a divorcee, or someone grieving her own aging, but simply as Claire, a woman who had loved, who had lost, and who was still capable of something more. That night, she lay in bed with her phone beside her, debating whether to message him. Her fingers hovered above the screen, unsure, heart pulsing with a familiar nervousness she hadn't felt since her 20s. She didn't message him. Not yet. But when she closed her eyes, she wasn't thinking about her past. She was thinking about his voice, his words, and how, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this next chapter as she thought. Something had begun. Something uncertain, yes, but something worth feeling. And for the first time in a long time, she was curious about where the story might go. Claire hadn't meant for it to become a pattern, but something inside her began to look forward to their small encounters. So much so that one afternoon, instead of waiting for fate to place him in her path again, she asked Daniel if he wanted to meet for coffee. She had hesitated before sending the message, her thumb hovering over the screen for longer than she cared to admit. But when he responded almost instantly with a simple, "I'd love to," her heart did a strange, weightless thing it hadn't done in years. Their coffee date was quiet, warm, and unexpectedly intimate. Not because of any romantic gestures, but because of the way time seemed to slow around them. They met at a small cafe tucked in the corner of the old downtown square, a place filled with the scent of cinnamon and the soft hum of conversation. Claire wore a deep blue scarf that Daniel complimented, and she noticed the way his eyes lingered, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel seen. They talked about favorite books, old songs, childhood memories, and the strange way grief sometimes hides inside everyday things, like grocery aisles or empty dinner tables. Claire found herself laughing with him. Not the polite kind of laugh she used with neighbors, or the tight smile she wore at family gatherings, but a real breathless laugh that made her feel younger than she had in years. And Daniel. He listened so carefully, nodding, leaning in, offering stories of his own losses, not to compete with hers, but to say, "I've been there too." With each conversation, Claire noticed how her world began to slowly change color. The gray she had grown used to was giving way to something softer, warmer. She started wearing lipstick again, just a hint. She played music in her kitchen, sometimes even danced alone while making tea. It wasn't that Daniel had fixed her. She didn't believe in that kind of rescue. But he made her feel awake again. Yet, despite the sweetness of it all, there was a tremble beneath her joy. Part of her pulled back, unsure. Was she being foolish? Was this too fast? Too late in life? Too risky? She'd spent so many years learning how to be alone that the idea of wanting someone again felt almost dangerous. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park near his bookstore, Daniel reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture, but Claire froze. He noticed. Instead of pulling away in frustration, he looked at her with that same soft steadiness and said, "You don't have to rush anything. I'm not going anywhere." That night, she sat on her bed for a long time, fingers tracing the outline of the hand he had almost held. Her heart longed for closeness, but her mind kept reminding her of the years behind her. The betrayals, the disappointments, the quiet heartbreak of a love that slowly faded rather than exploded. Was she brave enough to feel again? Could she let herself want something more without fearing the fall? Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper, and inside, Claire sat in the quiet, unsure of what to do next. But something deep within her had already begun to shift. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was considering the idea that maybe, just maybe, some stories don't end when you think they do. Some just pause and wait for the right moment, the right person, the right sentence to begin again. As the days turned colder and the leaves began to scatter across sidewalks like forgotten letters, Claire found herself retreating into the quiet corners of her life again. Despite the warmth she had begun to feel with Daniel, the comfort of his presence and the slow, careful way he was weaving himself into her world, something inside her remained tangled. One afternoon, while organizing an old drawer, she came across a photo she hadn't seen in years. Her ex-husband, and their children on a beach vacation long before things had started to fall apart. The photo wasn't framed. It had been tucked away carelessly. Yet when she looked at it, a deep ache surged through her. Not for the man she had divorced. She had made peace with that. But for the version of herself that once believed love would always be simple, that families stayed whole, that time would be kind. Holding that photo felt like opening a wound she thought had long since healed, and without fully realizing it, she began to pull away. The next time Daniel called, she let it go to voicemail. Then again, and again. Not because she didn't want to hear his voice, but because hearing it would mean acknowledging that something real was beginning between them, and real came with risk. Her silence wasn't cold. It was scared. 2 days passed before he showed up at her door, not angry or demanding, but quiet, holding a small old book in his hands. His coat was dusted with rain, and his hair clung slightly to his forehead, but he didn't look upset, just sincere. I wasn't sure if I should come, he said gently. But I couldn't just disappear without trying. Claire stood there, heart caught between shame and longing, unsure whether to invite him in or let him go. He handed her the book. It was a thin poetry collection, weathered and worn. The kind of thing someone treasured, not for the author, but for the way it made them feel. I thought you'd like this, he said softly. There's a line in there that's helped me more times than I can count. She opened the book to find a note tucked inside. It read, "Love doesn't have an age, only a pulse." Her eyes stung with tears, not because of the words, but because someone had taken the time to understand what she couldn't say aloud. That she was afraid, that she still carried guilt, that a part of her felt she was betraying a past life by daring to imagine a new one. Daniel didn't push her, didn't ask for explanations. He simply said, "I'll give you space, but I won't pretend I didn't feel something when I met you." And with that, he left. Claire stood in the doorway, long after he was gone, the book pressed to her chest, the echo of his voice still lingering in the hallway. It was easier to live in the past, easier to let nostalgia become a shield. But that evening, as the sky darkened and the quiet settled around her, she opened the book and began to read. Each line whispered to her like a secret she had once known, but forgotten. Love wasn't something you lost and never touched again. It was something that changed form, softened, returned in unexpected ways. And maybe it was time to stop protecting herself from the very thing she most deeply craved: connection, understanding, and the simple, terrifying beauty of beginning again. Claire didn't rush to call him. She let the days pass, slowly, almost tenderly, as if she were giving her heart time to catch up with itself. But Daniel's words, "Love doesn't have an age, only a pulse," kept returning to her in the quiet moments between errands, while folding laundry, even when she stood in line at the grocery store. She realized something. For all her fears, all her hesitations, she didn't want to go back to the woman who had settled for numbness. She missed the way Daniel made her laugh without trying, the steady way he listened, the feeling of her hand, almost being held. So one evening, just as the sky slipped from gold to violet, she walked to Pine and Page. The shop lights were still on, casting a soft glow through the windows. Her heart beat louder than it had in years. When she stepped inside, Daniel was there, seated behind the counter, glasses low on his nose, scribbling notes in the margin of a book. He looked up, and in that one look, Claire saw it all: surprise, relief, hope, and something else, something that felt like forgiveness. She smiled, tentative but real, and whispered, "I read the whole book." He stood slowly, unsure of what she was here to say. "Did it help?" he asked. Claire nodded. "It reminded me that I'm still allowed to feel, even now, especially now." There was a quiet pause between them, not heavy, but full. She stepped closer and added, "I was scared, not of you, but of what it would mean to let someone in again." Daniel reached for her hand, not suddenly but patiently, like someone who had been waiting not for the right moment, but for her. And this time, Claire didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his, and it felt both unfamiliar and deeply known, like remembering a melody she hadn't heard in years. they didn't need to say much. Instead, Daniel led her to the back of the shop, where a small reading nook was tucked beneath a canopy of fairy lights and old book covers. They sat, side by side on the worn couch, and for the first time, the space between them was filled not with longing, but presence. Claire told him more about her past, about the years of fading love in her marriage, about how she'd learned to shrink her needs to make everyone else comfortable. Daniel shared stories of his wife, of the guilt he carried for surviving her, and the fear that loving again would mean letting go. But maybe, he said softly, love isn't about replacing. Maybe it's about expanding. That night, as they talked long after the shop had closed, something inside Claire softened. She didn't have all the answers. She wasn't suddenly healed or fearless. But she had allowed someone to see her as she truly was, not as a role or a chapter closed, but as a woman still being written. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the windows, and for the first time in a long while, Claire didn't dread the future. She welcomed it. Not because it promised certainty, but because it offered possibility. And sitting there beside Daniel, fingers entwined and hearts gently unfolding, she realized that maybe love wasn't about how young you were, or how perfect the timing. Maybe love was about showing up anyway, willing, open, and brave enough to turn the page. The seasons shifted slowly, as they always do, but this time Claire felt them differently. Each falling leaf, each longer night, felt like a quiet marker of how much had changed, not just around her, but within her. Life didn't become suddenly magical overnight. There were still quiet mornings where she doubted herself, still moments when she looked in the mirror and saw the lines time had carved along her eyes and mouth and wondered, is this what someone falls in love with now? But Daniel had a way of answering those questions without ever needing to hear them. He noticed her, not just how she looked, but how she moved through the world. He admired the way she softened her voice when talking to children, how she paused before answering serious questions, how she always read the last page of a book slowly, like she didn't want to say goodbye. Slowly, she began to believe that maybe she was worth being noticed. Not in spite of her age or her past, but because of it. They spent more time together, some days cooking side by side in her small kitchen, other days walking through parks hand in hand, wrapped in scarves and quiet laughter. He introduced her to old jazz records, and she introduced him to her favorite movies from the 90s. They didn't rush anything. There was a kind of grace in their pace. Both of them had known loss. Both of them understood that love at this stage in life wasn't about fireworks. It was about warmth, steadiness, showing up when it matters. And yet, there were moments of magic. When he kissed her forehead as she fell asleep on his shoulder. When she found a note tucked into her coat pocket that read, "You make the ordinary feel extraordinary." When they sat in silence, and still felt more connected than in any conversation they'd ever had before. One afternoon, months after their first real conversation, Daniel took her back to Pine and Page after closing. The store was quiet, the shelves dimly lit. The world outside, dusted in snow. In the back corner, the same nook where they'd first truly let each other in, he had placed a single candle and 2 mugs of tea. Claire smiled, her heart full and unguarded, and sat beside him. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think I was done, that the part of my story where love lived had already passed." She looked at him, eyes gentle. "Me too." He took her hand, warm and familiar now, and said, But then you walked in, and it felt less like starting over and more like finally arriving. Her throat tightened, not with sadness but with something deeper. Gratitude, hope, belonging. She didn't need a ring or a grand declaration. This moment in its simplicity was everything, because love, at this point in her life, wasn't loud. It was quiet, consistent, and beautifully real. And as they sat together in the soft golden light, with the scent of books and peppermint, tea around them, Claire realized she had indeed started over. Not by going back to who she used to be, but by becoming someone braver, someone who dared to feel again, to open her heart when it would have been easier to close it. Her story hadn't ended when her marriage did. It hadn't ended when the children moved out, or when the loneliness set in. It had simply paused, waiting. For him. For this. For the beautiful truth that it's never too late to begin again, and that sometimes the best love stories come after the ones we thought had already been written.